American student was found dead in her home. The police immediately began an investigation, and soon several alarming facts came to light. Law enforcement had to consider 3 possible versions of what had happened, each more grim than the last. However, the mystery was only solved 2 years later, and the price of that truth was spilled blood. Brook Baker was born in 1981 in a small town in Indiana. From her school years, she had been passionate about journalism, worked for the local newspaper, and dreamed of making a career in the field. Energetic, goal-oriented, and sociable, she easily made friends and had a lively interest in any current issues. Shortly after graduating from high school, Brook moved to Vincennes, where she enrolled at the local university in the journalism department. At university, she quickly became part of the student newspaper, actively participated in its work, and made new friends. However, alongside her friends, she also gained some enemies. Brook was determined to write a serious journalistic piece that could create public resonance. In the fall of 1997, when she was 19, she came across troubling rumors circulating among students. There were talks on campus that several female students had fallen victim to sexual violence committed by members of one of the male fraternities. Sensing that she had stumbled upon an important and sensitive topic, Brook decided to conduct her own investigation. She began talking to the affected women, gathering information, and studying the details of the alleged crimes. But as soon as the fraternity members learned about her efforts, the journalist faced her first threats. At first, they confronted her directly, aggressively demanding that she stop digging into the matter. Then came anonymous messages warning of possible consequences. However, Brook remained steadfast. Her goal was to make the truth come to light and ensure that other female students would not become victims of similar crimes. The situation was escalating. One day, when Brook was at a friend's house off campus, several members of the fraternity unexpectedly showed up. They threatened her again, warning that her investigation could have catastrophic consequences for her. However, the situation did not escalate beyond loud threats, and Brook felt that this time she had managed to avoid danger. Yet, the anxiety never left her. Realizing that the threat might be real, Brook decided to take precautions. She moved out of the university dormitory and into a rented house near the campus. The house belonged to a university police officer, which, in her opinion, should provide her with extra security. Part of this decision was also influenced by her parents, who were aware of her investigation and the threats against her. They were genuinely worried for her safety and strongly advised her to be cautious. 2 weeks had passed since Brook Baker moved into her new house. Despite the threats, she continued working on her investigation and felt relatively safe within the walls of her home. However, on the morning of September 7, 1997, her younger brother decided to visit her and became the first to uncover the dreadful truth. He drove up to Brook's house and knocked on the door several times, but there was no response. He then tried the doorknob and was surprised to find the door unlocked. He thought maybe his sister was still asleep, but upon entering, he immediately realized that things were much worse. Entering the bedroom, he saw a horrific sight. Brook was lying on the bed in a pool of blood, showing no signs of life. In a panic, he called the police and an ambulance, but they could only confirm her death. From the very first moments of the investigation, the detectives were certain they were dealing with a brutal murder. The nature of the crime was evident from the abundant bloodstains in the room, the scattered belongings, and clear signs of a struggle. But one aspect particularly baffled the police: the faucet in the bathroom was running, and the bathtub was filled to the top with water. Towels and several other items floated inside. Everything suggested that the murderer had tried to wash away the traces of their crime. In the kitchen, investigators found a knife that had been thoroughly washed with cleaning detergent. Because of this, there were no fingerprints on it, nor on most surfaces in the house. This complicated the investigation. However, one important fact was even more troubling: there were no signs of forced entry into the house. This meant that either Brook had let the perpetrator in herself, or she simply hadn't locked the door. The autopsy revealed that the young woman died from multiple stab wounds. The killer inflicted 11 blows. Additionally, there were clear signs of sexual assault. However, despite the perpetrator's attempts to hide their identity, experts were able to extract a DNA sample from the victim's body. It was immediately checked against databases, but no matches were found. This indicated that the perpetrator had no prior criminal record. The investigators tried to find witnesses who might have seen someone at Brook's house on that fateful day. However, the neighbors hadn't noticed anything suspicious. There were no strange cars, no unfamiliar people, and no unusual sounds. It seemed as though the murderer came and went unnoticed. The investigation proved difficult from the outset. There were almost no clues, which meant the detectives had to work blindly. However, after speaking with Brooke's friends and family, the police learned a troubling fact. Before her death, the young woman had received threats from members of the university fraternity. Considering that she was planning to publish an article exposing possible cases of abuse on campus, investigators immediately turned their attention to these students. The fraternity members were interrogated, and DNA samples were taken from them. However, analysis showed no matches. This meant that the person who attacked Brooke was not one of those who had threatened her previously. Nevertheless, the police didn't rule out the possibility that someone from the fraternity might have hired an outside contractor to carry out the crime. However, this theory had a significant flaw. The murderer had entered the house without forced entry. Brooke's acquaintances claimed that after receiving the threats, she became extremely cautious and never left the door unlocked. Therefore, either she knew the murderer and let them in voluntarily, or the person managed to convince her to open the door. When the investigators informed Brooke's family and friends that the involvement of the fraternity seemed unlikely, they shared another troubling detail. After moving into the rented house, the young woman had repeatedly complained about the strange behavior of the landlord. This man, a university police officer, had come to her house unannounced several times, using his set of keys. On one occasion, he entered the house in the middle of the night while Brooke was sleeping and turned on the light in her bedroom. On another occasion, he entered while she was taking a shower. Each time, he claimed that he needed to take something, but Brooke didn't believe him and began to fear him seriously. The law prohibits a landlord from entering a rental property without the tenant's consent, and such actions seem especially suspicious for a police officer. However, this did not stop the man. He continued to appear under various pretexts. Given that he had keys, he could enter the house without leaving any signs of forced entry. When these facts became known to the city police, the investigators interrogated the landlord. The man categorically denied any involvement and voluntarily provided a DNA sample. Analysis again found no match with the genetic material found on the victim's body. After some time, the detectives found themselves at a dead end. No other evidence was found, and the investigation returned to an inconclusive state. However, the investigation soon took a new turn. Detectives discovered that shortly before her tragic death, Brooke had placed an ad in the local newspaper. She was looking for a roommate because she felt scared living alone. Her fear was triggered by the landlord's regular unannounced visits. Brooke hoped that if someone else moved in with her, the landlord would stop bothering her. In addition, she hoped that having a roommate would help reduce the cost of rent, which would significantly ease her financial situation. This information caught the detectives' attention, and they developed a new hypothesis. It's possible that the murderer responded to her ad, came to look at the apartment, and, once alone with Brooke, attacked her. This theory explained why there were no signs of forced entry into the house, but it also complicated the search for the perpetrator. Although none of the neighbors noticed any suspicious individuals near Brooke's house, it was impossible to identify the person who had responded to her ad. The police had no choice but to continue searching for new leads and pursuing the investigation. Months went by, and the case continued to drag on. The detectives did not lose hope and kept investigating all possible versions. During this time, 400 people were interrogated, and DNA samples were taken from 50 of them. However, none of these samples matched the DNA found on Brooke's body. Investigators even traveled to neighboring states to check on several suspects, but all their efforts were in vain. Nearly 2 years passed without any breakthroughs, and it seemed the case was doomed to be forgotten. But on July 5, 1999, when everyone had almost lost hope, the police received a report about the disappearance of another student from the same university where Brooke had studied. Erica Norman had vanished under mysterious circumstances. When the police arrived at her address, they discovered a horrifying scene. There were bloodstains on the floor and walls of the apartment. But that was only the beginning of what alarmed the detectives. The bathroom was filled to the brim with water, and the faucet was still running. A couch cushion floated in the water, and the young woman was nowhere to be found. These facts left no doubt. The crime was likely committed by the same person who had killed Brooke 2 years earlier. The detectives realized they finally had a chance to catch this maniac. And, despite all their previous failures, they got lucky. A massive witness interview campaign provided crucial information. On the day of Erica's disappearance, she was seen leaving a restaurant with another student, 22-year-old Brian Jones. Brian agreed to provide a DNA sample and even gave permission for a search of his house and car without a warrant, which immediately drew the detectives' attention. He also handed over the clothes he had worn on the day of Erica's disappearance. All of this seemed strange, considering that ordinary people usually don't cooperate so willingly with law enforcement. After carefully studying his background, the detectives learned that before this incident, Brian had no legal troubles and had never been involved in any crimes. This led them to think that perhaps he wasn't involved in the murder and that his behavior might have been driven by a desire to help the investigation. However, specialists found no traces of Brian's DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene related to Erica's disappearance. However, the DNA sample found on Brook's body remained in the lab. When it was compared to Brian's DNA, the result was staggering, a complete match. This discovery was a turning point in the case, and Brian was arrested. He was interrogated but denied all charges. Meanwhile, investigators continued digging deeper and soon discovered that Brian had a personal connection to Brook. He had lived in the same room as her boyfriend. This revelation strengthened suspicions, but the main question still remained: what had happened to Erica Norman? Based on the amount of blood found in her apartment, detectives did not hope for her to return alive, but they did not lose hope. 2 weeks later, after extensive searches, Erica's body was found. A farmer working in a neighboring state, Illinois, discovered her body in a cornfield. During the investigation, even more convincing evidence came to light. During a search of his car, blood traces were found on the steering wheel and door handles. Identical blood traces were discovered in his house on the shower door frame. All of these blood samples matched Erica's DNA. This collection of evidence made it almost impossible for Brian to justify himself. Given this evidence, his guilt was practically proven, and he was likely expecting a sentence that could lead to the death penalty. Apparently, the prospect of the death sentence frightened him, and he decided to confess to the murder of Erica Norman in exchange for a guarantee that he would not face execution. The trial of Brian went fairly quickly, and the judge sentenced him to 60 years in prison for the murder of Erica Norman. After that, the trial for the Brook Baker case began. An important part of Brian's deal with the prosecution was the condition that he would not face the death penalty for either of the murders. Instead, he confessed to only one crime, while claiming his innocence in the other. At first glance, such a deal might seem strange, but in reality, it was quite reasonable. If a criminal refuses to admit guilt and the investigation has only a limited amount of evidence, there is always a chance that the defense attorneys might find a loophole for acquittal. Even if that doesn't happen, delays in the process could last for years. A confession, on the other hand, removes these risks. Furthermore, even if the confession is only for one murder, the criminal would still receive a sentence long enough to spend many decades in prison. Thus, the deal ensured the guaranteed isolation of a dangerous criminal from society, which is undoubtedly a priority for justice. However, Brian's attorneys were unable to achieve the desired result. In December 2000, the court found him guilty of the murder of Brook Baker, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus an additional 20 years for committing violent acts. Despite the severity of the sentence, Brian retained the right to apply for parole in 2030, that is, 30 years after his conviction. At the time of sentencing, Brian was only 24 years old, which meant he could potentially be released at 54 if his request for parole was granted. However, the chances of that happening are very slim, as for criminals like him, the likelihood of parole is almost non-existent. It is unlikely he will be released, and he will probably remain in prison until old age. After Brian was behind bars, the police still had a question: did he have other victims? Clearly, his crimes were of a serial nature. Detectives were absolutely sure of this, and one thing could be said with certainty: had Brian avoided punishment, he would have definitely continued his crimes. Therefore, it is important to remember that safety always comes first. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your attention.